And good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Let me begin by saying that there is no dispute about the fact that Mike Williams was murdered. The evidence is going to show beyond any doubt that he was shot in the face and killed by Brian Winchester, a man he thought was his friend. Brian Winchester is not on trial. In fact, he's never even been charged with the murder. He's going to testify here as a witness, and there's an important part of that you haven't heard yet that will be in evidence, and I want to tell you about it, and that's the fact that he is going to be testifying under a grant of immunity. And what that means in this particular case, the kind of immunity that was given to him, is that he will be able to testify as he pleases about this without any fear that the state will be able to use that testimony against him. Now, the immunity agreement is such that the state can't even use leads or hints or clues that were developed from that testimony. So he has not been charged, and I think it's fair from the evidence to conclude that it's not likely he will ever be charged for this murder. But he's here as a witness, and he's going to testify that Denise Williams helped him plan the murder. And I will just say right now, I think the facts that were outlined by Mr. Fuchs about what Mr. Winchester says are fairly accurate. That's what I think he's going to say. That's not the issue you're going to have to decide. The issue you're going to have to decide is whether to believe him. His testimony in this case is, and I should say also that the facts as Mr. Fuchs related them are pretty much the substance of all of the evidence against Denise Williams. There isn't anything else besides that. Brian Winchester's testimony is totally uncorroborated. In plain English, there isn't anything to back it up. You're not going to hear evidence from a witness who said that he or she saw Denise Williams participating in the planning or the execution of this murder. You're not going to hear any witness talk about DNA evidence or fingerprint evidence. There's no tangible evidence or physical evidence to connect Denise Williams to this crime. No confession, no admission, nothing. All you're going to have to go on is the word of the man who actually committed the murder. Now, of course you're going to hear testimony about Denise Williams and her family. Denise Williams and Mike Williams knew each other from childhood. They dated each other through junior high and high school and college. And they maintained a long-term relationship with the Winchesters, Brian Winchester and his wife Kathy Winchester, who was then Kathy Thomas. The four of them were classmates together at North Florida Christian, and also they were classmates together at Florida State. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Williams got married in 1994, and by all accounts, they had a happy marriage. The evidence is not going to suggest any reason why Mrs. Williams would have been unhappy with her husband. Mike Williams was a good husband, he was a good father, and he was most certainly a good provider. You're also going to hear testimony from people who knew Mike Williams during this time period. His financial advisors, his friends, his insurance agents. There's not going to be any proof of any kind, no evidence that any of these people heard or saw to suggest that Denise Williams was having any sort of marital problem with Mike Williams. You're simply not going to see any evidence of that. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Williams had a daughter, Ansley, who was born in May of 1999. And a few months after that, Mike Williams wanted to investigate the possibility of increasing his insurance. And so he had some conversations about that with a financial advisor, a man named William Vic Gainey. Mr. Gainey advised Mr. Williams that he should have at least $1 million in life insurance. And so Mr. Williams, and I should point out that Mr. Williams also had a policy that was written by the Winchesters, and I say the Winchesters, Brian Winchester and his father, Marcus Winchester, were insurance agents, and they had sold Mike Williams a policy before, a smaller policy. So when Mike Williams got this advice from Mr. Gainey, he went back to the Winchesters to buy an additional policy. And Marcus Winchester did, in fact, sell him a $1 million life insurance policy. And at that point, he was that policy, together with the two that he already had, he had coverage, insurance coverage in the amount of $1,750,000. But you're going to hear evidence that this was not too much insurance for a person in Mike Williams' financial situation. Mr. Williams was employed as a real estate appraiser with the Ketchum Agency, and he was earning $185,000 a year, approximately $185,000 a year. Denise Williams did not, there's no evidence that Denise Williams participated in any of these discussions about the insurance. And there's no evidence that she did anything to influence her husband Mike to buy this insurance. The only evidence you're going to hear on this point is that the matter was initiated by Mike Williams himself, with the advice of his advisor, Mr. Gainey, his friends, and with the assistance of two insurance agents, Brian Winchester and his father, Marcus Winchester. At this point, I'd like to give you a brief synopsis of what Mr. Brian Winchester's version of the murder is, how it came to be. He's going to tell you that he and Mrs. Williams wanted to be together, but that she was opposed to divorce for religious and personal reasons. She was not willing to get a divorce from her husband, Mike. And so, according to Mr. Winchester, they decided that the only thing they could do was kill him. This is what he's going to tell you. So they settled on a plan to have Mr. Winchester go out hunting with Mr. Williams. And Mr. Winchester was going to make sure that Mr. Williams was wearing these bib waders, and I don't know how familiar you might be with that, but it keeps the bottom half of your body dry if you're wading in the water. But he was going to make sure that Mr. Williams was wearing these bib waders while he was in the boat. And he was going to wait for a point in time when Mr. Williams would stand up in the boat, and then he was going to push him over. And the idea was that water would fill up in the bib waders, and Mr. Williams would not be able to keep his body above the surface to get air. That was the plan. So Mr. Winchester's going to say that Denise Williams' role in the plan was to give her husband, Mike Williams, permission to go hunting. And even by his own testimony, that's what he says her role was, to give Mike permission to go hunting. So they were supposed to go out hunting on December 9th, 2000, but my recollection of these facts, not my recollection, but my expectation about these facts is a little bit different from what Mr. Fuchs presented. I think what you're going to hear is that Mr. Williams called Mr. Winchester and said, "I can't make it." And then Mr. Winchester called Denise Williams and said, "Hey, what gives? We were supposed to go out on this. We were supposed to do this thing on this occasion." And at that point, Mrs. Williams was reported as saying that she had gotten cold feet. Told her husband that he couldn't go hunting. So Mr. Winchester then revived the plan for the following week, and what you're going to hear in that interim week between December 9th and December 16th is that there was very little contact between Brian Winchester and Denise Williams. Virtually all of the contact was between Brian Winchester and Mike Williams. They set up the plan where to meet. They were going to meet at a gas station near I-10, and they were going to drive Mr. Williams in his truck and boat and trailer, and Mr. Winchester in his Suburban out to Lake Seminole. When they got out there, they launched the boat, got out into the water. Mr. Winchester waited for a point in time when Mr. Williams would stand up, and he pushed him out of the boat. But the plan didn't work out exactly as Mr. Winchester expected it to. Mr. Williams, as it turned out, was able to get out of the waders, and he started swimming back toward the boat. At that point, Mr. Winchester picked up his shotgun and he shot Mr. Williams in the face. The body started to sink. Mr. Winchester grabbed the body by one arm and pulled it up alongside the boat, piloted the boat with his other hand. This is the story according to Mr. Winchester. Piloted the boat with his other hand back to the shore. Then he picked up Mr. Williams and loaded him in the back of his Suburban. Went home. Later that day, Mr. Winchester went to Walmart and he bought a shovel and a tarp. And he took Mr. Williams' body out to Carr Lake just off Meridian Road and buried him in a shallow grave. Then he went home and he cleaned out his Suburban with some bleach. I preface this account by saying that this was Mr. Winchester's version of how this murder occurred. I think when you hear the evidence, you're going to have some questions about whether it happened, he said it happened, whether it happened the way he said it happened. But what I think is not in question is that it did in fact shoot and kill Mike Williams. And there's no evidence, absolutely no proof that Denise Williams had anything to do with that or that she even knew about it. Now, Mr. Fuchs mentioned that when Mr. Winchester was finally, I guess, apprehended, he said that he was having an affair with Denise Williams in the 3 years before the murder was committed. Well, he is going to say that, but you're also going to hear from law enforcement investigators who will tell you that they were not able to find any evidence of any affair. Two of the main investigators in this case were Tully Sparkman, an investigator for the state attorney's office, and Mike Devaney, who was at that time a special agent for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Both of these men worked on this case extensively. And both of them will tell you that they were not aware of any evidence, other than what Brian Winchester says, that Denise Williams was having an affair with Brian Winchester prior to December of 2000. So you're not going to see any phone records to verify that Denise Williams was calling Brian Winchester or vice versa. You're not going to see any security camera footage of them going in and out of buildings. You're not going to hear from any witness who said they saw them in a private setting. You're not going to see credit card receipts for dinners or hotel bills. What you're going to hear, and all you're going to hear, is that Brian Winchester claims he was having an affair with Denise Williams. Now, Brian Winchester was, of course, a friend of Denise Williams and also with her husband, Mike Williams. He and his wife, Kathy, went out with Brian and Denise on many occasions, and there were some occasions, the evidence will show, where Brian and his wife, Kathy, and Denise went out, just the three of them. But I think, if anything, the evidence is going to show that the relationship between these parties, the relationship that Denise Williams had with Kathy Winchester, was much closer than the one that she had with her husband, Brian. Kathy and Denise were close friends in the years, before and after Mike Williams disappeared, and they continued to be close friends for many years after that. And we're going to present some evidence in this case that is going to flatly contradict what Mr. Winchester says, that his claim that he was having an affair with Denise Williams and that they cooked up this plan to kill Denise's husband so that they could be together. The evidence to contradict that, two main things, and I'm going to go through them with you. One of the main things is that there is strong evidence in this case that Brian Winchester tried very hard to stay married to his own wife after the murder. And Denise Williams had a serious relationship with another man after the murder. So after 2000, I think several years after the disappearance of Mr. Williams, Kathy Winchester and her husband Brian were having some marital trouble all along, pretty much, I think, starting even before the disappearance of Mike Williams. But anyway, a few years after that disappearance, they were in more serious marital difficulty, I guess, facing a divorce. And you're going to hear evidence that Brian Winchester tried very, very hard to reconcile so that he could stay with his wife, Kathy Winchester. But Kathy Winchester was bent on getting a divorce, and she wanted to go through with it, and so they got divorced. She's going to tell you that at the final divorce hearing, Brian Winchester, the man who was supposed to have done this to be with Denise, was sitting in the back of the room sobbing, begging her not to go through with the divorce. He wanted to stay married to her. We're going to ask him about that. We're going to ask him to explain that. And the other thing I mentioned is that Denise Williams had a relationship with another man, that's a man named Charles Bunker. You'll hear from him too. That started a couple of years after her husband disappeared. Mr. Bunker was a co-worker, and that relationship developed, as many do, sort of in a more of a friend way to begin with. But then as it went along, it got more serious, and they had some things in common. Mr. Bunker was a single parent. He was caring for a child, and so was Denise. But during the course of this relationship, there were occasions where Brian Winchester threatened Mr. Bunker, and you're going to hear about that. On one occasion, Mr. Bunker went with Denise to Atlanta, on a trip to Atlanta, and Mr. Winchester showed up unexpectedly at their hotel room and threatened them both. Denise Williams tried to smooth things out with him to calm him down. But this went on for some time, and eventually the relationship between Charles Bunker and Denise Williams came to an end. Now, Mrs. Williams did eventually marry Brian Winchester, but that was 5 years later, 5 years after her husband disappeared. And the evidence that you're going to hear will put this in the proper context. She knew Mr. Winchester from high school and college. They'd been friends for many years. Mr. Winchester's son, Stafford, was about the same age as Mrs. Williams' daughter, Ansley. They were friends. Before the marriage, Denise Williams laid down some very strict rules. Brian Winchester had to be baptized. In fact, he was. Brian Winchester had to go through a year-long premarital program in Mrs. Winchester's church. These were conditions that Denise Williams insisted on before she married Brian Winchester. Now that marriage didn't end well. They separated in 2012 at Mrs. Williams' insistence, and in 2015, Denise Williams filed for divorce. There were many, many efforts on the part of Brian Winchester to save his marriage with now Denise Williams. He couldn't do that, and I came a point in time where she wasn't speaking to him. So in a final desperate attempt to save his marriage, he decided that he would kidnap Mrs. Williams. On the morning of August 15th, 2016, about 2:30 in the morning, he climbed into the back of her SUV, armed with a gun. I mean the cargo area of the SUV, armed with a gun, waiting for her to get up to go to work. She did eventually get up and go to work, get in the car, and when she realized that he was in the car, she screamed. Now, Mr. Winchester's going to say that he only wanted to talk to Denise Williams. He only wanted to try to reconcile. But he had a handgun, and you should also know that he had a tarp and 2 containers of bleach in the cargo area. He put them there. They weren't in the Suburban. He put them there. But he says he only wanted to talk to her. Now, fortunately, she was able to calm him down with the promise, I guess, that they were going to try to work things out. She had no intention of doing that, none whatsoever. She went straight to the police, and he was arrested for armed kidnapping. So we're going to present evidence in this case to show you that Mr. Winchester has a motive to lie to you, that he has a motive to make up this accusation against Mrs. Williams. He didn't mention anything about her alleged participation in this murder until after he realized that he was facing a life sentence for kidnapping. He didn't mention it until after he realized that Mrs. Williams was going to go into court and ask for a life sentence. And at that point, he made an agreement with the state for immunity. And we're going to talk about that, and we're going to give you all the details about that in the trial. But just a thumbnail sketch of it, the agreement for immunity essentially ensured that Mr. Winchester would not get a life sentence, or that the state wouldn't ask for a life sentence on the charge of kidnapping. And it also guaranteed, that anything he said about the disappearance of Mike Williams could never be used against him. So that is what he gained by the agreement. In return, of course, he's going to give testimony, and the testimony he's going to give is going to be pretty much what Mr. Fuchs outlined about Denise Williams. There's one other aspect of this that goes to his motive, and I want to discuss it with you. It was not only a desire to get a much lighter sentence, or to get off of a sentence on the murder case altogether, for that matter, but it was also a sense of revenge, and there's evidence of that you're going to hear. We're going to ask Mr. Winchester, why he would make a statement like this against Mrs. Williams. And I expect him to say that he felt as though Mrs. Williams threw him under the bus by turning him in for kidnapping, and that he should now throw her under the bus. This is what I expect him to tell you. So that's the case before you. You're going to hear about the multiple investigations in this case. You're going to hear about the lives of all of these witnesses over the last 18 years. What you're not going to hear is any credible evidence that Denise Williams participated in this murder. On that point, you're going to have to rely entirely on the word of a murderer and a convicted felon. Now, we're going to have a chance to come back up and speak to you again at the close of all the evidence in the case. By then, you are going to have more than a reasonable doubt about the guilt of Denise Williams. And we are going to ask you then to find her not guilty. Thank you.